I remember the thrill of ding-dong ditching as a kid, the rush of ringing someone's doorbell and running away, hoping to escape before getting caught. It was the perfect way to add some excitement to our boring suburban lives. But one night, my friends and I made a grave mistake. We rang the doorbell of a man who was not amused by our prank. He chased us down the street, shouting obscenities and promising to catch us. We thought we had escaped his wrath when we finally reached the safety of our own homes. But as we walked inside, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. We peeked through the curtains and saw the man standing outside our window, watching us with a sinister grin. Our hearts pounded in our chests as we tried to figure out what to do next. The man tapped on the glass, and we knew we had to call for help. We dialed my dad's number, hoping he would come to our rescue before it was too late. The man began to bang on the window, trying to break in. We could hear him shouting, promising to teach us a lesson we would never forget. We waited in terror, huddled together in a corner of the room. The man continued to pound on the window, and we could see the glass starting to crack under the pressure. It felt like an eternity before we heard the sound of my dad's car pulling up outside. As soon as my dad walked in the door, he could sense something was wrong. He saw the damage the man had caused and immediately called the police. They arrived within minutes and took a statement from each of us, trying to piece together what had happened. It turned out that the man who had been stalking us was a known criminal with a history of violent behavior. He had been released from prison just a few months earlier and was living in the neighborhood under a false name. He had targeted us specifically because we were easy targets, and he thought he could intimidate us into staying quiet. My dad was furious when he heard about the man's actions. He made sure to install extra locks on all the doors and windows, and he warned us to be more careful in the future. We never played ding-dong ditch again, and I still have nightmares about that night. It was a stark reminder that even the most harmless pranks can have dangerous consequences. It was supposed to be a fun night with my friends. We had all planned a sleepover at my house while my parents were out of town. We were all laughing, playing video games and eating junk food when suddenly we heard a strange noise coming from outside. At first, we didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a raccoon or some other small animal. But then we heard the noise again, and this time it sounded closer. I went to check the front door, and to my horror, I saw a man trying to break in. I quickly ran back to my friends and told them what was happening. We were all terrified and didn't know what to do. We tried calling the police, but the man had cut the phone line. We were trapped inside with a stranger trying to break in. We could hear him trying to force the door open, and we could hear his footsteps outside the window. We were all huddled together, trying to stay quiet and hoping that he wouldn't find us. But then we heard him coming up the stairs. We knew that he was getting closer and closer, and we were all paralyzed with fear. We could hear him trying to open the door to my room, and we knew that we were out of options. And then suddenly, the door burst open, and the man was standing there, staring at us with a crazed look in his eyes. We screamed, but it was too late. He had invaded our home, and there was nothing we could do to stop him. As the man entered the room, we were all paralyzed with fear. He was tall, with greasy hair and a menacing look on his face. We could smell the alcohol on his breath, and we knew that he was dangerous. He walked slowly towards us, and we could see that he had a knife in his hand. We tried to back away, but we were trapped in the corner of the room. He lunged towards us, and we screamed at the top of our lungs. But then something strange happened. The man stopped in his tracks, and he looked around the room as if he was confused. He lowered the knife, and for a moment, he looked like he was going to leave. But then he suddenly lunged towards us again, and we knew that we had to do something. We grabbed whatever we could find, pillows, blankets, and even our own bodies, and we fought back. We were able to fend him off for a few moments, but he was too strong. He knocked us to the ground, and we could feel his knife pressing against our throats. We were sure that this was it. We were going to die. But then, We heard a loud crash from outside. It sounded like someone had broken into the house. The man was distracted, and we used this opportunity to escape. We ran down the stairs as fast as we could and out the back door. When we got outside, we saw that our neighbor had come to our rescue. He had heard the commotion and had called the police. The man who had invaded our home was arrested, and we were safe. But even though the danger had passed, we were all traumatized by what had happened. We had never felt so helpless and vulnerable in our lives. It was a reminder that our sense of safety and security could be shattered at any moment, and that we had to be prepared for anything. I remember the night my friends and I decided to have a sleepover. It was just like any other sleepover, filled with games, junk food, and scary stories. But little did we know, we were about to experience something we would never forget. We were all cozied up in our sleeping bags, ready to settle in for the night when my friend Jake asked a question that sent shivers down our spines. "Hey, did anyone else hear some weird noises coming from downstairs earlier?" Jake asked, his eyes wide with concern. The rest of us looked at each other, trying to recall if we had heard anything. But before we could answer, Jake spoke up again. "It sounded like someone was moving furniture or something. But my dad's out of town on a work trip, so it couldn't have been him. Do you think we should go check it out?" My heart began to race at the thought of exploring the dark and creepy house, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Yeah, let's go see what's going on," I said, trying to sound brave. We made our way down the stairs, our flashlights in hand, cautiously looking around every corner. As we reached the living room, we saw that the furniture had indeed been moved around. But to our horror, we also saw something else. Standing in the corner of the room was a tall, dark figure. We froze in fear as it slowly turned its head to look at us. Its eyes glowed red in the dim light, sending chills down our spines. Just as we were about to scream, the figure disappeared into thin air. We stood there, stunned and terrified, unsure of what had just happened. It wasn't until the next day that we learned the truth. Jake's dad had been gone for weeks, and there was no way he could have been moving furniture in the house. We never did find out who or what was responsible for the strange occurrences that night. To this day, I still get goosebumps thinking about that sleepover and the terrifying encounter we had with the unknown. I still shudder when I think about that fateful sleepover on vacation. It was supposed to be a fun trip with my friends, but it turned out to be a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. We had rented a cozy cabin in the woods, surrounded by towering trees and a serene lake. The cabin was rustic and quaint, but it had all the amenities we needed for a comfortable stay. We had planned to spend our days hiking, swimming in the lake, and exploring the nearby town, but it was the nights that we were most excited about. On our first night, we decided to have a sleepover in the living room, with blankets and pillows spread out on the floor. We brought out our favorite board games and snacks, and we settled in for a night of fun and games. At first, everything was going great. But as the night grew darker, the atmosphere in the room changed. It felt like something was watching us from the shadows. Then we heard a strange noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like someone was rummaging through the drawers. We all froze, too scared to move. We didn't know if it was an intruder or something worse. We thought about calling the police, but we didn't have cell phone service and the landline was dead. After what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. But that was only the beginning. We started hearing footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. And then we heard a voice, a chilling whisper that sent shivers down our spines. "Get out," it said. We were terrified. We huddled together, trying to come up with a plan. But we were too scared to even move. And then, the power went out, leaving us in complete darkness. That's when we heard it. A loud banging on the front door. It sounded like someone was trying to break in. We were trapped, with no way out. We could hear the hinges starting to give way, and knew that the door would soon come crashing down. We started screaming and shouting for help, hoping that someone would hear us, but there was no response. We were alone, with something sinister trying to get in. But then, suddenly, everything went silent. The banging stopped, the footsteps faded away, and the voice was gone. We sat in the darkness, too scared to move, until morning finally arrived. The next day we tried to rationalize what had happened. We told ourselves that it was just our imagination playing tricks on us, or that it was a wild animal that had gotten into the cabin. But deep down, we knew that it was something more. We never spoke about that night again. But we all knew that something was off about that cabin in the woods, and we never went back there again. The memory of that night still haunts me to this day, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't made it out alive. I remember the night of my friend Sarah's sleepover like it was yesterday. We were just a group of innocent, giggling teenagers, excited to spend the night together in her big old house. We had popcorn, candy, and our favorite horror movies lined up. We were all set for a fun-filled night. Little did we know that our plans were about to take a horrifying turn. It was almost midnight when we heard a strange noise outside the house. At first, we tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind. But the noise persisted, and it sounded like someone was trying to break in. We all huddled together, scared and unsure of what to do. We peeked out of the window and saw a dark figure lurking in the shadows. It was a man, and he looked like he meant business. We immediately realized that we were not alone in the house. We were trapped with a loose criminal, and we had no way to call for help. The man started to bang on the door, and we could hear him shouting for us to let him in. We were too scared to move, too terrified to even make a sound. We knew that if he got in, we would be at his mercy. Suddenly the lights went out, and we were plunged into darkness. The only light we had was from our phones. We clung to each other, shaking with fear as we listened to the man's footsteps getting closer and closer. It was like a nightmare come to life. We heard him trying to break in through the windows, and we knew that we had to act fast. We made a run for it, running down the stairs and out of the house. We ran for what seemed like miles, not daring to look back until we were sure that we were safe. As we ran, we could hear the man's footsteps getting closer and closer. We could hear him breathing heavily, like a predator closing in on its prey. We knew that we had to keep moving, but our legs felt like jelly, and we were gasping for air. Finally, we saw a light in the distance, and we knew that we had to make it there. It was a small convenience store, and we could see the man getting closer and closer. We ran faster than we had ever run before, the adrenaline pumping through our veins. We burst through the door, panting and out of breath. The store clerk looked at us in surprise, but before we could say anything, the man burst through the door behind us. He was holding a knife, and his eyes were wild with rage. The store clerk immediately called the police, and we huddled together in the corner, watching in terror as the man advanced towards us. We could see the glint of the knife in the dim light of the store, and we knew that we were in grave danger. But then, something unexpected happened. One of my friends, Samantha, who had always been the quietest and most reserved of us, stepped forward. She faced the man head-on, her voice steady and calm. "Please, sir," she said, "we don't want to hurt you. We just want to get out of here safely." To our amazement, the man lowered his knife. He looked at Samantha for a moment, as if considering her words, before turning around and fleeing into the night. We all breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to be alive. When the police arrived, they told us that the man had been on the run for weeks, and that he had a long criminal record. They said that we were lucky to have gotten out alive, and that we had shown incredible bravery in the face of danger. As we sat in the back of the police car, being driven home, we all looked at each other in awe. We had been through something truly terrifying, but we had come out on the other side stronger and braver than ever. From that night on, we made a promise to always look out for each other, no matter what. We knew that we were stronger together than we ever could be alone. And even though we were still scared, we knew that we had the courage to face anything that came our way. I was camping alone with my dog, Duke. As night fell, Duke's growling and barking made me feel uneasy. Though I tried to ignore it and get some rest, in the middle of the night, Duke's barking became so frantic it woke me up. I grabbed my flashlight and peered outside, but I couldn't see anything. The next day I decided to go for a hike with Duke, but he wouldn't leave my side. As dusk began to set, I heard a strange noise that sounded like a mix between an animal and a human. Duke started barking and I saw a figure emerging from the trees. It was a skinwalker. Duke and I ran back to our campsite, and I could feel the skinwalker getting closer. Just as I thought we were done for, the skinwalker lunged towards me, but Duke jumped in front of me and bit the skinwalker. It let out a blood-curdling scream and disappeared. But something was off. Duke was acting strange, almost as if he was possessed. I did some research and found out that skinwalkers could possess animals, and the only way to save them was to kill the skinwalker. I knew what I had to do, but I never thought I would have to kill a skinwalker to save my dog. I grabbed my shotgun and set out to find the skinwalker. I wandered deep into the woods, following Duke's growling until I spotted the skinwalker lurking in the shadows. It looked like a monster, with glowing red eyes and twisted limbs. Without hesitation, I raised my shotgun and fired, hitting the skinwalker square in the chest. It let out a deafening howl and charged towards me, but I managed to reload and fire a second shot, blowing its head off. As the creature fell to the ground, Duke's eyes returned to their normal, bright brown color. He nuzzled my leg and I knew he was grateful. But something about the whole experience had left me feeling uneasy. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I had just killed something that was once human. As I walked back to camp with Duke by my side, I couldn't help but wonder if there were more creatures like the skinwalker out there, lurking in the shadows. I realized that, while I may have saved Duke, I had opened my eyes to a world that was much darker and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I remember the day my friends and I decided to go camping in the remote woods of Darkwood Forest. It seemed like a great idea at first, but we had no idea what was waiting for us out there. We set up our tents, started a fire, and had a good time, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. But as night fell, things started to get weird. We heard strange noises in the distance, and the wind picked up, making the trees sway eerily. We all felt uneasy, but we shrugged it off as just our imagination. That's when we saw them. In the distance, we saw a group of people in black robes, holding torches and chanting. We froze, unsure of what to do. But as they got closer, we saw the fear in their eyes, and knew that we had to run. As we ran, we stumbled upon a clearing, and saw the cult carrying out a sacrifice. They had a young girl tied up on an altar, and their leader was holding a knife, ready to plunge it into her heart. We gasped in horror, but knew we couldn't stop to help her. We had to save ourselves. We grabbed our things and bolted through the woods, hoping to escape. We could hear their footsteps getting closer, and we knew that they were coming after us. We ran faster, our hearts pounding in our chests, but we could feel their presence behind us. We didn't know where to go, and the darkness was our only refuge. Finally, we stumbled upon a clearing, and we could see our car in the distance. We ran towards it as fast as we could, but we knew that the cult was still behind us. We made it to the car, and as we sped away, we could see the cult disappearing into the darkness. We were shaken, scared, and grateful to be alive. We vowed never to go camping in Darkwood Forest again, and we never did. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I can never forget the image of that poor girl being sacrificed to the cult's twisted beliefs. I remember the camping trip vividly, even though it happened many years ago. I was just a child, full of wonder and excitement about sleeping under the stars. But little did I know, that trip would turn out to be a nightmare, It was the second night of our camping trip, and my family and I were sitting around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. As the night grew darker, my parents decided it was time for my little brother and me to go to bed. We climbed into our tent, nestled in our sleeping bags, and soon fell asleep. But something woke me up in the middle of the night. I could hear a strange rustling sound outside our tent. At first I thought it was just an animal, but then I heard footsteps approaching closer and closer. My heart was racing as I peered out of the tent's opening. That's when I saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching us. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing and wearing a hat that obscured his face. I tried to scream for my parents, but fear gripped my throat, and no sound came out. The man beckoned me to come closer, his voice a low whisper. I knew I had to get out of there, but my little brother was sound asleep, and I didn't want to leave him behind. So I mustered all my courage and slowly unzipped the tent's entrance, ready to bolt if necessary. But the man was gone. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They thought it was just a bad dream, and that I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I had seen and heard. That night, I didn't sleep a wink, terrified that the man would come back. But he didn't. And as we packed up our campsite and headed back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped a terrible fate. To this day, I still wonder who that man was and what he wanted. And I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine whenever I think about that camping trip and how close I came to being lured into the woods by a stranger. Excited for a break from everyday life, my friends and I went camping in the rainforest. As we sat by the fire, we told each other scary stories. But little did I know, a real-life horror story was about to unfold. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. A tall, thin figure was lurking in the shadows. They were human, but something about them was off. Their movements were jerky and unnatural. The figure appeared more frequently, watching us from the shadows. They vanished whenever we tried to approach them. One night, after drinking, I woke up at early dawn to go to the bathroom. When I heard a branch snap, thinking it was one of my friends, I glanced. I was wrong. Had I not have already been peeing, I would have pissed my pants. Suddenly, the man began to sprint at me, chasing me through the forest, his laughter echoing. We left immediately after I returned. I couldn't help but wonder, who or what was that figure, and why were they tormenting us? It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a chance to unplug and disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. But it turned into a nightmare I can never forget. As I set up my tent and started a fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump. I tried to reassure myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling only grew stronger as the night wore on. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard strange noises outside my tent. It sounded like something was scratching at the fabric, trying to get in. I clutched my flashlight tightly and tried to ignore it, but the scratching continued. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the scratching stopped. I breathed a sigh of relief and closed my eyes, thinking that I could finally get some rest. But then I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, getting closer and closer to my tent. I was paralyzed with fear as the footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, slow and steady, as if someone was standing just inches away from me. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Suddenly, the zipper of my tent was pulled open, and a figure loomed over me. It was a man, his face obscured by the darkness. He reached down and grabbed me by the throat, choking me until I could barely breathe. Just when I thought I was going to die, the man released his grip and vanished into the night. I lay there, gasping for air, not daring to move until the sun rose. As I emerged from my tent, I saw a note pinned to the tree next to me. It read, April Fools. It was then that I realized my friends had played a cruel joke on me, staging the entire ordeal to scare me. I was relieved and angry all at once, but I couldn't deny the rush of adrenaline that had kept me up all night. Though it was a terrifying experience, it was also one I would never forget. I was excited for a fun camping trip with my friends, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. We set up our tents deep in the woods, surrounded by darkness and the sounds of nature. As night fell, I noticed a figure watching us from the shadows. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, with wild hair and a manic look in his eyes. At first I tried to ignore him, thinking he was just a harmless vagrant passing through. But as the night wore on, I realized that he was getting closer and closer, stalking us through the trees. The man began to taunt us, making strange noises and throwing rocks at our tents. We tried to scare him off, but he was too persistent. He seemed to be enjoying our fear. As the hours passed, the man's behavior became more and more erratic. He started yelling and screaming, waving a knife around in the air. My friends and I knew we had to do something before he hurt us. We made a plan to sneak away while the man was distracted, but he was always one step ahead. He seemed to know exactly where we were at all times. In a desperate attempt to escape, we ran deeper into the woods, hoping to lose the man in the darkness. But he was relentless, chasing us down and cornering us by a cliff. It was then that I realized we were in grave danger. We were trapped, with no way out. The man lunged at us with his knife, and my friends and I fought back with all our might. It was a brutal struggle, but we managed to overpower him and escape. Shaken and terrified, we made our way back to civilization, vowing never to return to those woods again. Hopefully my experience doesn't shy you away from camping. It was supposed to be a fun-filled camping trip with my friends, but it turned into a nightmare. We had just walked back from the carnival, laughing and joking about the clowns we had seen. Little did I know that the very same clown would be the one to haunt me that night. As we set up our tents and settled down for the night, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching us. It was an eerie feeling, but I tried to ignore it and focus on getting some rest. But that's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps getting closer and closer to our campsite. I woke up my friends, and we peered out of our tents, trying to see what was making the noise. And that's when we saw him, the clown from the carnival, with his painted face and sinister smile standing just a few feet away from us. We froze in fear, not knowing what to do. But then he started running towards us, waving his arms and making strange noises. We knew we had to get out of there, and fast. We grabbed our things and ran as fast as we could, deeper into the woods. But the clown was right behind us, and he was gaining on us. As we ran, we could hear his laughter echoing through the woods, sending chills down our spines. It was as if he was toying with us, enjoying the fear he was causing us. We stumbled and fell, but we didn't stop running. We couldn't let the clown catch us. Finally, we saw the lights of a nearby cabin, and we ran towards it, hoping that someone would be there to help us. We banged on the door, screaming for help, and thankfully, someone answered. We told them what had happened, and they called the police. When the police arrived, they searched the woods, but they couldn't find the clown. But I knew he was still out there, somewhere, waiting for his next victim. I'll never forget that night, and I'll never be able to look at a clown the same way again. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it's been years since that terrifying night in the woods. I was a reckless teenager who loved nothing more than pushing the limits, and that night I decided to sneak out and go camping in the woods with some of my friends. We snuck out of our homes quietly, trying not to make any noise that would alert our parents. We packed our backpacks with food, drinks, and a tent, and headed out into the dark, eerie woods. At first, everything was fun and exciting. We told ghost stories around the campfire and laughed and joked around. But as the night grew darker and the woods became quieter, an uneasy feeling started to creep up on me. That's when we heard it. A blood-curdling scream coming from deep in the woods. We all froze, too scared to move. And then we heard it again, closer this time. We quickly packed up our things and tried to leave, but it was too late. Suddenly a man appeared out of nowhere, yelling at us to get out of his property. We didn't know what he was talking about, but he was clearly angry and aggressive. We tried to explain that we were just camping, but he wouldn't listen. He chased us through the woods, his angry voice echoing around us. We ran as fast as we could, our hearts pounding in our chests. We didn't know where we were going. We just knew we had to get away. Eventually, we stumbled upon a road and were able to find our way back to civilization. We never spoke about that night again, but it left a lasting impact on me. I learned that sometimes, pushing the limits can have scary and dangerous consequences. I was playing video games in the living room when I heard a faint voice calling for help. I took off my headset and listened closely. It sounded like my dad, and he was asking for me to come to the attic. I made my way upstairs and opened the door to the attic. "Dad, are you okay?" I called out. But as soon as I stepped inside, I realized something was off. The attic was dark and empty, and there was no sign of my dad. I called out again, but there was no response. It was then that I remembered my dad was out of town on a work trip. The voice I had heard couldn't have been his. My heart started racing as I realized I was alone in the house. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and started making my way back downstairs. But as I descended the stairs, I heard a soft whisper from behind me. I turned around, but there was nobody there. Suddenly, I felt like I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump, and every shadow seemed to take on a life of its own. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the darkness. Finally, I made it back to the living room, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I turned on all the lights and tried to distract myself with my video games, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. To this day, I don't know what caused that voice in the attic. But one thing is for sure, I never want to be alone in that house again. I remember the time when I was a young child, and my family had just moved into an old Victorian house. My parents had told me stories of the house's history and how it was over 100 years old. I was excited to explore every nook and cranny of the house, but there was one place that always gave me the creeps: the attic. The attic was at the very top of the house, and it had a rickety old ladder that led up to it. I would always peek up there, but I never had the courage to climb up. One day, however, my curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to go up and explore. As I climbed the ladder, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. It was dark and musty, and I could hear creaking noises from above. I finally reached the top and pulled myself onto the floor. I shone my flashlight around the room, but all I could see was dust and cobwebs. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It sounded like someone was shuffling around in the corner. My heart started racing, and I began to feel like I wasn't alone. I pointed my flashlight towards the corner and gasped in terror. There was a man with his back facing me, hunged over. His feet dangled off the ground, and his body swayed slightly. He didn't move, and I couldn't see his face. I was frozen with fear, and I didn't know what to do. I knew I had to get out of there, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. Finally, I managed to turn around and scramble down the ladder as fast as I could. When I reached the bottom, I ran to my parents and told them what I had seen. They didn't believe me at first, but when they went up to the attic, they found the man just as I had described him. It turned out that he had been a former owner of the house who had committed suicide years before we had moved in. From that day on, I never went back up to the attic again. The thought of that man's lifeless body still haunts me to this day. I always loved exploring abandoned places, so when my friend suggested we check out the abandoned house at the end of the cul-de-sac, I eagerly agreed. It was an old, dilapidated house with boarded-up windows and a rusted gate. As we approached the house, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It was as if the house was staring back at us, daring us to enter. We pried open the gate and cautiously made our way up the overgrown path to the front door. The door was locked, but we managed to find a way in through a window that had been left slightly ajar. The house was dark and musty, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling and dust covering every surface. We started exploring the first floor, opening doors and peeking into empty rooms. As we made our way up to the second floor, we started to hear strange noises. Creaks and groans echoed through the house, as if it were alive and angry that we were there. We tried to ignore it and pressed on, climbing the stairs to the attic. The attic was small and cramped, filled with old furniture and boxes of forgotten memories. Suddenly, we heard the sound of footsteps coming from below. We froze, listening intently as the footsteps grew louder and closer. We knew we had to hide, so we scrambled to find a place to take cover. I squeezed into a small space between a dusty dresser and the wall, holding my breath and trying to remain silent. As the footsteps reached the top of the stairs, my heart was pounding in my chest. I could hear my friends breathing heavily as they hid in their own hiding places. The footsteps grew louder and closer until they stopped right outside the attic door. I could hear someone fumbling with the lock, trying to get in. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as the door slowly creaked open. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move as a shadowy figure stepped into the room. We didn't know who or what it was, but we could feel its malevolent presence. It seemed to be searching for something, moving slowly and deliberately around the room. I could hear my friends whimpering in fear, and I knew that we were in grave danger. Finally, the figure seemed to give up its search and turned to leave. We waited until we were sure it was gone before emerging from our hiding places. We quickly left the house, vowing never to return again. But the memory of that terrifying experience stayed with me, haunting me for weeks to come. As I climbed up the creaky wooden stairs to my grandparents' attic, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My grandparents had both passed away a few weeks ago, and my family had tasked me with the job of clearing out their old belongings. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old books and mothballs, and I found myself coughing as I made my way deeper into the attic. As I began to sift through boxes of old photos and keepsakes, I noticed a large, ornate chest tucked away in the corner. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly made my way over to the chest. I hesitated for a moment before I slowly lifted the lid, and my heart skipped a beat as I realized what I had discovered. Inside the chest were stacks of old journals, each one filled with my grandparents' handwriting. As I began to read through them, I quickly realized that my grandparents had been hiding a dark secret. The journals were filled with tales of a mysterious cult that my grandparents had been a part of for decades. They spoke of secret meetings, strange rituals, and even human sacrifice. My heart raced as I read through the gruesome details, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. As I continued to dig through the chest, I found more and more evidence of my grandparents' involvement in the cult. There were strange symbols etched into old artifacts, and even a few human bones hidden away in the corner. I felt my hands shaking as I realized that my beloved grandparents had been hiding such a dark secret for all these years. I didn't know what to do with the information I had uncovered, but one thing was certain: my world would never be the same again. I woke up to the sound of shattering glass and muffled voices. Panic set in as I realized that someone was breaking into my home. My first instinct was to call the police, but my phone was nowhere to be found. I had to hide and hope they wouldn't find me. I remembered the old crawl space in the basement, a place I never liked going to as a child. I quietly made my way down the stairs, feeling a sense of dread building in my chest. The air was musty and stale, and my heart was pounding in my ears. As I crawled through the narrow space, I could hear footsteps above me, and my fear intensified. I could hear the burglars rummaging through my belongings, breaking things as they went. My mind raced with the possibility of being caught and what they might do to me. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and I could hear them coming down the stairs. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't notice the small entrance to the crawl space. I heard one of them say, "Check the basement." The door creaked open, and a flashlight scanned the area. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure they could hear it. The light paused for a moment, but then continued on, and I let out a silent sigh of relief. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, but it must have only been minutes. When I finally emerged, I found the basement ransacked, my belongings strewn about, but the burglars were gone, and I was safe. That night left me with a permanent fear of break-ins and a lingering dread whenever I had to go down into my basement. I never liked going into the basement. It was always too dark and too cold for my liking. But tonight, I had no choice. My husband had sent me down there to fetch some tools he needed for a home repair project. As I descended the creaky wooden stairs, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The air was thick with the smell of must and mildew. I quickly found what I was looking for and turned to head back up the stairs when I heard a noise. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again. A faint rustling sound coming from somewhere deep within the basement. My heart began to race as I tried to convince myself that it was just the old pipes settling. But then, I saw him. A man in ragged clothing, covered in dirt and grime, stumbled out from behind a stack of boxes. His face was twisted into a scowl, and his eyes bore into mine with a fierce intensity. I froze, unable to move or speak as he began to approach me. I could feel his hot breath on my neck as he reached out to grab me. I screamed and tried to push him away, but he was too strong. I could feel his fingers digging into my skin as he pulled me closer. I knew then that he was an escaped convict, and my mind raced with fear as I imagined all the terrible things he might do to me. But just as I thought all was lost, I heard the sound of police sirens in the distance. The man looked up, startled, and released me before running off into the darkness. I stumbled up the stairs, still shaking from the encounter. My husband was waiting at the top, and I clung to him as he called the police. As they arrived, I knew that I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, and from that day on, I never went back into the basement alone. I was alone at home, watching TV on the couch when I heard a loud noise coming from the back door. I froze, not knowing what to do. It was a stormy night, and the rain was hitting the windows with force. The wind was howling, and the whole atmosphere was eerie. Suddenly I heard footsteps coming from the basement. My heart sank, and I realized with horror that someone had broken into my house. I tried to call the police, but my phone was dead. I had no way of calling for help. I tiptoed towards the door leading to the basement, trying to be as quiet as possible. I could hear the intruder moving around down there, and my mind raced with terrifying thoughts of what could be happening. As I slowly opened the basement door, the sound of creaking echoed through the house. I could see nothing but darkness, but I knew I had to go down. I grabbed a flashlight and started to make my way down the steps, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw a figure standing in the corner. I shined my flashlight on it and realized it was a man. He turned to face me, and his eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. I tried to run, but he caught me and dragged me into a room I had never seen before. The room was empty, except for a single chair in the center. He tied me to the chair and whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't have come down here." The fear that gripped me was beyond anything I had ever felt before. I don't know how long I sat there waiting for my fate. Eventually I heard sirens outside, and the intruder fled. The police found me, shaken and traumatized, but alive. To this day, I can't help but think of what could have happened if I had never gone down to the basement. I had been house-sitting for my friend for a few days now. The house was old but cozy, and the neighborhood was quiet. However, there was one thing that made me feel uneasy. The basement. Every time I walked past the door that led to the basement, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was like there was something down there, something sinister, waiting for me. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It was a faint scratching sound, like something was trying to claw its way out. I tried to ignore it, but the noise grew louder and more persistent. I knew I had to investigate. I cautiously made my way down the stairs, the creaking wood beneath my feet making me jump at every step. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I was plunged into darkness. I fumbled around for the light switch, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I found it and flicked it on. The sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing in the corner, its back to me. It was hunched over, and its arms were long and thin, like they were made of rubber. Its skin was pale and clammy, and it smelled of decay. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry. The figure slowly turned around, revealing a face that was twisted in a grotesque grin. Its eyes were sunken and empty, and its teeth were razor sharp. I backed away, but it was too late. The figure lunged at me, its fingers wrapping around my neck. I struggled, trying to break free, but it was too strong. As I gasped for air, I knew that I was going to die. The last thing I saw was the figure's twisted grin, before everything went dark. When my friend returned home a few days later, he found my lifeless body in the basement. The police investigated, but they never found any evidence of foul play. To this day, I wonder what it was that I saw in that basement. Was it a figment of my imagination, or something far more sinister? One thing is for sure. I will never forget the terror I felt that night, and I will never enter that basement again. I woke up to a loud banging at my front door. It was a blizzard outside, and I couldn't see anything beyond my window. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should open the door. I decided against it, but the banging persisted. I wrapped myself up in a blanket and walked to the door. As soon as I opened it, a gust of wind rushed in, along with a group of masked men. They were armed with guns and knives, and their eyes were filled with a kind of madness I had never seen before. They pushed me to the ground and I struggled to get up, but they were too strong. They tied me up with a rope and started ransacking my house. They went through everything, breaking things, and taking whatever they could find. I begged them to stop, but they just laughed at me. They seemed to be enjoying themselves, as if they were relishing the fear and pain they were inflicting on me. I tried to escape, but they caught me and brought me back to my living room. I was surrounded by them, and I knew there was no way out. They started torturing me, cutting me with their knives and burning me with cigarettes. My screams echoed through the house, but no one was around to hear them. Hours passed, and I thought I was going to die. But they didn't kill me. Instead, they left me there, tied up and bleeding, in the middle of my destroyed home. The blizzard outside had grown worse, and I was trapped. Days went by, and I was slowly losing hope. I was starving, freezing, and my wounds were infected. I thought it was the end for me. But then I heard a knock on the door. It was the police, and they had come to rescue me. I was taken to the hospital, and I survived. But the memory of that home invasion still haunts me to this day. The thought of those masked men coming back to finish what they started is enough to make me never want to leave my home again. I'm driving home from work in the middle of a blizzard. The snow is coming down so thick and fast that I can barely see the road in front of me. The only thing guiding me is the faint light from my headlights. My hands are tightly gripping the steering wheel as I struggle to keep the car on the road. I'm tense and nervous, and my heart is beating so fast that I can feel it pounding in my chest. Suddenly, I see something in the distance. It's a figure, standing in the middle of the road. I try to brake, but the car skids on the icy surface and continues forward. As I get closer, I realize that the figure is a person. I'm about to hit them, but they disappear into the snow. I can't believe my eyes. Was I hallucinating? I shake my head, trying to clear my mind. But then I see another figure, and another. They all look like people, but they're not moving. They're just standing there, staring at me with blank expressions on their faces. I'm starting to feel scared now. Who are these people? Why are they out here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a blizzard? I try to swerve around them, but they're everywhere. The snow is getting deeper, and my car is struggling to move forward. I'm trapped, surrounded by these strange, motionless figures. I can feel their eyes on me, and it sends shivers down my spine. I'm starting to panic. I have to get out of here. I try to reverse, but the car won't budge. I'm stuck, and the figures are closing in on me. I can hear their footsteps crunching on the snow. I'm about to scream when suddenly, a hand reaches out from the snow and grabs my shoulder. I turn to look, and there's a face right in front of me, inches from my own. It's a woman, her skin blue from the cold. She opens her mouth to speak, but all that comes out is a chilling scream. I try to pull away, but she's holding me tight. I can feel her cold breath on my face. I'm frozen with fear. Suddenly the car jerks forward and I'm free. I hit the gas, and the car lurches forward, and I speed away from the figures and the woman. I look in the rearview mirror, and they're all gone. It's just me and the snow. I finally make it home, but I can't shake the feeling of fear. I can still hear the woman scream, and I can still feel her cold breath on my face. I never want to drive in a blizzard again. The blizzard had come out of nowhere, blanketing the small town in snow and causing schools to shut down. But for some reason, my school had decided to remain open. Maybe it was because we were a private school, or maybe it was because the administration thought the students would appreciate having something to do on a snow day. Whatever the reason, I was stuck there. As the day wore on, the storm worsened, and before I knew it, we were locked down. The school was a maze of hallways and classrooms, and as I wandered the empty halls, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the howling of the wind outside. I made my way to the library, hoping to find some solace in books. But as I walked through the aisles, I noticed something strange. The books were all upside down, as if someone had come through and intentionally messed them up. I tried to ignore the feeling of unease that settled in my stomach, and instead focused on finding a book to read. But as I reached for one on a high shelf, I heard a sound behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, coming from somewhere in the stacks. I crept down the aisle, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw it. A figure, huddled in the shadows, watching me. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew it wasn't a student or a teacher. It was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't have been there. I backed away slowly, but then it stood up, and I saw its face, or lack thereof. Its head was just a featureless mass of flesh, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. I screamed and ran, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get away. But the thing pursued me, its footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I ducked into a classroom and locked the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it on the other side, scratching and pounding, trying to get in. Hours passed, and the storm outside raged on. I don't know how long I sat in that classroom, waiting for the thing to leave, but eventually the noise stopped. When I finally emerged, the school was still locked down, but the creature was nowhere to be found. It was as if it had never existed at all, but I knew it had, and I knew that I would never be able to forget the terror I had felt, alone in that school during a blizzard. I woke up to complete darkness and the sound of howling wind battering the walls of my cabin. The blizzard outside was relentless, and the snow was coming down so hard that I could barely see anything. I reached over to the nightstand and fumbled for my phone, but it was dead. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no way of contacting anyone for help. I tried to remember how I had ended up here. My car had broken down a few miles back, and I had no choice but to walk the rest of the way. But in the midst of the blizzard, I had lost all sense of direction. I had stumbled upon this cabin by sheer luck, and it had seemed like a stroke of good fortune. But now, I wasn't so sure. The silence was deafening, broken only by the howling of the wind. I stood up and walked over to the window. The snow was so thick that I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. The trees were bending under the weight of the snow, and I could hear the branches creaking under the strain. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized just how isolated and vulnerable I was. And then, I heard a knock at the door. My roommate subleased his room using Craigslist without telling us. The three of us in the house were all around 22 years old. The guy that sublet the room was 36, unemployed, socially awkward, and a pothead. Not that there's anything wrong with that. He would blare Metallica all day. He would just stay in the house, only leaving at odd hours. Really sketchy. Then one day my roommate noticed his guitar was missing, and then another guitar was missing. We confronted him. After about 20 minutes of bullshit excuses, he admitted he pawned them for the power bill, and he wouldn't have rent for us. We called the police so we could report the stolen guitars, since you need to have a report to get anything from a pawn shop back. It turns out he already had a warrant out for his arrest for the same shit a town over. Anyway, the cops confronted him in our house while he was frantically trying to get all his stuff packed. He was coming down the stairs with all his luggage when the cops asked him to step outside. Right before he went outside to talk to the cops, he said, "Don't take any of my shit," in what I think was a joking manner. Either way, he was arrested, and we put it on the curb. Good times. I had an entertainment center advertised, and a woman asked to come over to have a look at it. We set up a time, and when the time came, she didn't show up. I texted her, and a couple hours later she replied, and asked if it was too late to come by. It was 10 p.m., but I said okay. She said she would be there in 10 minutes, but wasn't there 20 minutes later, and I texted her again. 10 more minutes, she said. But she hadn't shown up by 11 p.m., so I texted again and said we would have to do it another day, and she replied that she was just pulling up. I go to my front door, and sure enough, she is pulling into the driveway, and there are about 4 or 5 other people in the car with her. They all get out and start walking towards the door, and I ask them what they are doing, and the woman says they all want to see the entertainment center. I told her that only she can come in, and at that point I wasn't sure I even wanted her to. She says she needs at least one other person's opinion. I say no. She gets indignant, and I ask her to leave, and she says that I am not being a very good Christian. I say I am fine with that, and went into my house and locked all the doors, peeking out the window. One of the dudes who was with her is pissing at the end of my driveway, but then they get in the car and drive away. The whole thing was super bizarre. Was moving out of an apartment that had washer and dryer hookups into one that did not. So I sold my washer and dryer. Ended up having separate buyers. Guy who bought the dryer was great. He was getting it for his daughter who was going to college. I helped him load it up in his truck. He gave me the payment, and I never heard from him again. The guy who bought the washer was a different story. I got a text from him, asking if it was still available. We haggled the price, all normal stuff. We set a time, and I waited for him to get there. Now, I only had 1 week left in the apartment, so I didn't care too much about random people coming to my home like I normally would. Pretty much all of my stuff was moved into my new place, but the internet wasn't turned on yet, so I was still just sleeping on an air mattress in the old one for the time being. He ended up being a few hours late and showed up in a truck that was used for transporting large glass panes. He had like 5 people with him, all crammed onto the front bench seat of the truck. They loaded it onto the truck with it leaning at a 30-degree angle against the glass pane rack, or whatever you would call it. He tried to haggle it down to a lower price, but I didn't budge. He left and I thought it was done. Later that night I started getting texts from him about how it doesn't work, and he wants his money back. I told him, as it was written in the post, that it was sold as is, and was working. I assume he damaged it from the way he rigged it on his truck. Well, after a day he starts calling me and cussing me out, texting death threats, and I have other random numbers calling me doing that same. 2 nights after I sold it, I woke up at 3 a.m. with people banging on my door yelling. Luckily I lived on the 2nd floor with no easy access to the windows. I sat there for about 15 minutes while they continued to yell through the door. The next day I moved the rest of my stuff into my new apt and never went back other than to turn the keys in. I still got calls and texts from him on random numbers for 2 months over a $150 washer. I don't sell stuff on Craigslist anymore. Posted a few items for free, with the ad stating the items were sitting on my front porch. I would check every 15 minutes and remove the ad when they had been claimed. I also stated I had a newborn infant sleeping in the house and asked people not to knock or ring the doorbell, as it would cause my dogs to bark and wake the child. I checked frequently, and in about 45 minutes, the items were gone. I immediately removed the ad and resumed my viewing of The Watchmen. About 30 minutes later, the doorbell rings. I hush the dogs and reluctantly answer my front door. It's a large Larry the Cable Guy-esque guy, wearing a trucker cap that read "Deer Hunting." He states he is there for the items I posted for free. I proceed to explain that the items have already been claimed, and he becomes very angry, saying that he drove 45 minutes to pick them up. As he's shouting at me, he looks into my living room and sees my TV screen. Paused, and on glorious display on my 60-inch TV is Dr. Manhattan's glowing blue wang. Clearly not familiar with the series, and presumably not a fan of comics, Mr. Deer Hunting instantly changes moods from angry to disgusted. He says, "Boy, what the fuck is that on your television? You watching some Smurf porn or some kind of shit like that? And you said you got a baby in the house. I ought to call those government people and have them take that poor little baby away from you, you damn pervert." No, that's not a typo. He pronounced it pervert. I promptly thanked him and closed the door. I needed a new roommate quickly, and eventually settled on this chick from Florida who was moving out to San Diego. She initially came off as a little goofy and naive over the phone, but in person she was just strange. She had no sense for personal boundaries, would eat all my food, use my laptop in my room when I wasn't home to go on plentyoffice.com, and would barge into my room when I had friends over to say the weirdest shit, all in the first week. She did and said a ton of weird things in the month she lived with me. She started hanging out with a coworker from Subway along with her coworker's boyfriend who just got out of jail and 4 of his friends. They really only came around because she would buy stuff, and they laughed at the dumb shit she would do and say. She would always leave the window cracked because she lost her keys a lot, and would talk about how she did that all the time. Anyway, her friends broke into the house, stole my TV, my laptop, the smaller TV I had in my room, this wedding dress my aunt wanted me to sell on eBay for her, a bunch of DVDs, and my prescription glasses. I called her freaking out, and she was just getting home and she said she had called the cops on ME because her broken laptop got stolen and suggested I took all my stuff out of the apartment to steal her crappy broken laptop. Cops came and pulled me aside and told me she seemed unstable and suggested I don't use Craigslist for roommates anymore. I had her backed against the wall and was screaming at her with my finger in her face when the cops walked in. I thought I was screwed when they saw that, but after talking to her for 5 minutes they seemed to understand my frustration with her. The cops just took down what was stolen, and I took her key away and put her 1 box of crap outside the apartment. I eventually got my stuff back on my own because I made up some bullshit about having hidden cameras, and I wouldn't show them to the cops if I got all my stuff back. Somehow that worked. The other night I'm asleep in my apartment. I hear my front door open, but just figure it's my sister coming over to crash on my couch. She got in a fight with her boyfriend. Happens sort of regularly. She's the only one with a key to my apartment. I heard her moving around and figured she was just getting settled and making something to eat. I go back to sleep and think nothing of it. Wake up the next morning for work, and she's not there. Weird since it was 5 a.m., so I text and ask if she came over. She says no. Was home alone and maybe 12 years old. A really annoying boy from my neighborhood liked me, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. My parents left to go somewhere and I was sleeping. I was woken up by the phone ringing. It was a prank phone call saying all sorts of nasty things they wanted to do to me. I just hung up. It was the mid-80s. As soon as I was back in my bedroom, unsettled by the call, this crappy boy knocked on my window and scared the living shit out of me. I've never been so happy to see my parents as I was that day. I was living in my first apartment alone in college in 2015. It was a Friday night and I was on Skype playing video games with friends. It was like midnight, and there was a knock on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw someone from my complex I had spoken to a few times on the other side of the door looking nervous and scared. I opened the door but kept the door chains on and asked him what was going on. He told me someone was passed out on the stairs and looked sick, and he had heard me talking on my Skype call through the door, so he knocked on my door for help. I went out into the hall with him, and he showed me the person passed out in the stairs. It was my across-the-hall neighbor. He was obviously very, very drunk. The other guy at the complex reached down to help him up, and the neighbor pulled a messy swing at him. Missed completely. We talked him down and managed to get him up the stairs to his door, the drunk guy throwing sloppy swings every now and again at us. He took like 10 minutes finding the right key for his door. Every time we tried to help him, he would get angry and try to punch us. He got into his apartment, closed and locked the door, and we heard him collapse on the ground on the other side. We called the non-emergency line wondering if this guy had alcohol poisoning or if he had drove home. No one was with him, so we had no idea how he got back home, and he seemed drunk enough for it to be bad. Non-emergency came out and banged on the door for a good while before the drunk guy managed to unlock it, and I heard an ambulance come, and they took the drunk man to the hospital. I received a call from the police the next day saying he had to be hospitalized, and his stomach pumped because of alcohol poisoning. Me and that other guy probably saved his life by helping him and getting him taken to a hospital. However, they also found a gun on this man. He was a criminal and not supposed to own a firearm, and definitely did not have a permit to carry it around. He came back with it on him from wherever he was drinking. The cops said it was probably a good thing he was as drunk as he was because he forgot he had a gun on him. So he was throwing sloppy punches instead of pulling a gun on us when he was consistently angry at us through the encounter. I definitely could have died that night. Several years ago, I was woken by a loud pounding sound around 2 a.m. I woke my husband and we searched the house, turning on lights as we went, but we avoided the kids' room, as we didn't want to wake them if we didn't have to. We got to the other end of the house and hadn't seen anything unusual or heard the pounding again. But then we heard it again, and we knew it came from the kids' room. Mama Bear came out and tore down the hall. We lived in Salt Lake City at the time, and it was shortly after Elizabeth Smart was abducted, so I was terrified. The door to the room was blocked shut. I was sure there were at least 2 adults in the room stealing my kids. When we finally got the door open to crack, it turned out, not so much. My then 18-month-old had climbed out of his crib and had wedged his bum up against the door, and he was fast asleep lying on the floor with his legs propped up against the door, and every once in a while he'd kick the door, again, in his sleep. I think that's the most afraid I've been in my own home. After separating from my husband, I rented a little house in the country for my 3-year-old son and myself, so not home alone, but kind of. It was the perfect little place for my budget, but it was very secluded. There were no neighbors for miles. The main road connecting 2 small towns passed in front of the house. Though the road saw very little traffic, I was concerned my son would get out and be hit by a car. I was diligent about latching the screen during the summer to keep my little one in. One afternoon after playing in the yard, I set my son up with the toys in the front room, then went to the back to make dinner. I'd just started boiling water for the pasta when I heard the screen door slam. I'd forgotten to latch the screen. I turned from the stove, calling out to my son. I thought he'd gone outside. The yard was big, and I thought I'd be able to scoop him up before he reached the road. I ran out of the kitchen. That's when I saw my son, standing between me and the stranger in my living room. I was paralyzed. My throat began to close, and I didn't know if I'd be able to speak. The man was very thin and dirty. He looked as if he'd spent the day under a car or in a ditch. Every scary hitchhiker movie came to mind as I raced to process what was happening. My sweet little boy was holding his toy train up to the man as if to offer him a turn with it. I didn't know if he was there to take my son, to hurt us, to rub us. I just knew we were alone, and even if I could get to my phone and dial 911, it'd take far too long for anyone to get to us. The man said, "I'm not going to hurt you. Your son let me in. I didn't mean to scare you. I'll leave." He walked out. I grabbed my son and ran to the bathroom, the only room in the house with a door that locked. I held him on my lap and tried to keep my body from shaking. I said, "Honey, remember Mommy said we don't talk to strangers?" My sweet little guy said, "He wasn't a stranger, he was at our house." Hey everyone, if you enjoyed today's scary stories, consider subscribing and dropping a like on the video. If you have any ideas for what stories you would want to hear next, feel free to drop a comment below. Stay sleepless.